The old reptilian warrior sat in his chair and stared at the wall, where pictures of his dead friends hung in neat rows. His scales had turned gray with age, and his hands shook when he reached for his drink. The young journalist across from him adjusted her recording device and waited for him to speak. Kethvar had agreed to this interview after years of refusing to talk about the war. The memories were too painful and too strange for most people to believe. But now, in his final years, he felt the need to tell someone what really happened when the humans came to the galaxy. "You want to know about the human wars?" he said in his rough voice. "Everyone calls them wars, but that is wrong. Wars have rules, and limits and reasons that make sense. What we had with the humans was something else entirely. It was an education in madness." The journalist leaned forward. She had heard stories, but never from someone who was actually there. Kethvar had been a young officer on the Coalition flagship Silent Dawn when first contact happened. He was one of the few who lived through everything that came after. "The galaxy was peaceful then," Kethvar continued. "We had 400 species working together under the Coalition. There had been no major conflicts for 3 centuries. We thought we had figured out how to live together. We had rules for everything. Trade agreements and territorial boundaries, and laws that everyone followed. It was a good system." He paused to take a sip from his cup. The liquid inside was blue and steamed in the cool air of the room. Then the humans came from a little blue planet in the outer rim. At first we thought they were just another primitive species that needed guidance. They had basic space travel and simple weapons. Their technology was maybe 1,000 years behind ours. We sent diplomats to make contact like we always did, Kethvar. Remembered the first human delegation that came aboard the Silent Dawn. There was a man named Greg Patterson who spoke for them. He was calm and polite and asked good questions about how the Coalition worked. There was also a woman named Lisa Harper who seemed to study everything around her with sharp eyes. Patterson was their diplomat, but Harper was something else. She looked at our weapons and our defenses and our ship layout like she was memorizing every detail. When our captain showed them our main battle computer, she asked questions that made our tech officers nervous. She wanted to know about our response. Times in our communication protocols and how long it took to scramble our fighters, the young journalist wrote notes quickly. "Did you suspect they were planning something?" "Not then," Kethvar said. "We thought she was just curious. Primitive species often are amazed by our technology. But later I realized she was not amazed. She was learning. There is a difference between wonder and tactical analysis." He stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the Zephyrian homeworld stretched green and peaceful under twin suns. The Coalition Council met for weeks to decide what to do about the humans. They seemed harmless enough. Their planet was far away and they had no military threats to anyone. We offered them junior membership in the Coalition like we always did with new species. Did they accept? They said they needed time to think about it. That should have been our first warning. Every species we had ever contacted jumped at the chance to join the Coalition. The benefits were obvious: protection and trade and technology sharing. But the humans wanted to study our laws first. They wanted to understand exactly what membership would mean. Kethvar turned back to face the journalist. His eyes were dark with old memories. Greg Patterson came back 6 months later with their answer. They would join the Coalition, but with conditions. They wanted guarantees about their independence. They wanted the right to maintain their own military. They wanted assurance that Coalition law would not override their basic rights. Those seemed like reasonable requests. They were. That was what made it so strange. Most species gave up some independence for the security of Coalition membership. It was a fair trade. But the humans acted like their independence was worth more than all the benefits we offered. Patterson kept talking about something he called freedom. He said it was not negotiable. The old warrior sat back down, and his chair creaked under his weight. "We granted their requests because they seemed harmless. a few thousand ships and primitive weapons. What threat could they pose to a coalition of 400 species with millions of ships and technology they could not match? He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Lisa Harper smiled when we signed the treaty. I thought she was happy about joining the coalition. Years later, I realized she was smiling because she had just gotten everything she needed to prepare for war. But there was no war yet. No. The war came later when some of our member species decided that humans were too dangerous to leave alone. But that first meeting taught me something important about humans that I did not understand until much later. They do not think like us. When we look at a superior force, we calculate odds and make rational decisions. When humans look at a superior force, they start planning how to beat it. Kethvar finished his drink and set the cup down with shaking hands. The real tragedy is that we could have been friends. The humans were not naturally aggressive. They just refused to be controlled by anyone. If we had left them alone, there would have been no war. But some species in the coalition could not accept that a primitive race would dare to make demands. The journalist checked her recording device. What happened next? Next came the Proxima incident. And that is when the galaxy learned what humans really were. Kethvar's voice grew quiet as he began to tell the story of Proxima. The journalist could see pain in his old eyes as he remembered what came next. The Krillian Empire had always been trouble, he said. They were an insect species that thought they were better than everyone else. Most of the time, the coalition could keep them in line, but they had rogue factions that sometimes acted on their own. He stood again and walked to a wall covered with star charts. His finger traced a path between systems as he spoke. One of these rogue groups captured a human colony ship. It was called the New Horizon, and it carried 50,000 civilians, including families with children. The ship was traveling to establish a new settlement when the Krillians attacked it. The journalist looked up from her notes. Was this planned? We never found out for sure. The Krillians claimed it was just pirates acting without orders, but the timing was suspicious. There were coalition species that wanted to test human resolve. They wanted to see how these newcomers would react to a real crisis. Kethvar returned to his chair and his hands gripped the armrests tightly. The coalition response was standard. We sent negotiators to talk with the Krillians. We offered them compensation for releasing the hostages. We followed all the proper protocols that had worked for centuries. Did the negotiations work? The Krillians demanded territory in exchange for the hostages. They wanted 3-star systems and formal recognition as an independent empire. The Coalition Council was preparing to make a counteroffer when the humans acted. The old warrior's voice became strained as he continued. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the human response fleet. I say fleet, but it was really just converted civilian ships, mining vessels and cargo haulers and passenger transports. Nothing that looked like a military force. He paused and took a deep breath. Morrison sent one message to the Krillian stronghold. He said the humans were coming to collect their people. The Krillian commander laughed and sent back a recording of human prisoners being tortured. He said the humans could watch their people die unless the coalition gave him what he wanted. What did Morrison do? He accelerated to attack speed and never slowed down. The Krillian stronghold was built into an asteroid field. It had defensive platforms and fighter squadrons and shields that could stop anything the humans had. By all military logic, it was impossible to assault. Kethvar walked to another wall where weapon displays showed the progression of galactic military technology. The humans did not care about military logic. Morrison divided his force into 3 groups. The first group was the fastest ships loaded with nothing but fuel and explosives. They flew straight into the defensive platforms and detonated themselves. The journalist stopped writing. They committed suicide. The Krillians thought so too, but it was tactical. The explosions created debris clouds that blocked the defensive sensors. The second group of human ships flew through the debris and landed troops directly on the asteroid surface. He pointed to a tactical display that showed the battle. While the Krillians were dealing with boarders, the third group of ships started, ramming the main fortress. These were cargo haulers the size of small buildings. When they hit at full speed, they cracked the asteroid apart. How long did the battle last? 6 hours. The Krillian stronghold had stood for 1,000 years. It had survived attacks by entire coalition fleets. The humans destroyed it in 6 hours using ships that were not even designed for war. Kethvar sat down heavily. But the cost was terrible. Morrison's ship was the last one destroyed. He stayed behind to make sure all the hostages were evacuated. His final transmission was simple. He said, "Nobody touches our people." The journalist looked at her notes. Did they save the hostages? All 50,000. Not one human civilian died in the rescue. But Morrison lost half his fleet and thousands of crew members. Any rational species would have negotiated. The humans chose to fight a battle they could not win and somehow won it anyway. What was the coalition's reaction? Shock. We had never seen anything like it. The Krillians were experienced warriors with superior technology. The humans should have been slaughtered. Instead, they achieved total victory through pure determination and tactics that bordered on insanity. He stood and walked to the window. Again. The news spread across the galaxy within days. A primitive species had defeated one of the Coalition's strongest military forces using converted civilian ships. Every species in the galaxy suddenly realized they had misjudged the humans. Did this change how the Coalition treated them? Some species became more respectful. Others became more afraid. The hegemony of tall grasses sent a delegation to Earth to study human military capabilities. The Crystal Collective began monitoring human communications. The Void Walkers started building additional defenses on their border worlds. Kethvar's reflection in the window looked old and tired. But the real change was in how humans were perceived. Before Proxima, they were seen as harmless primitives. After Proxima, they were seen as unpredictable and dangerous. Did the humans understand this change? Lisa Harper visited our ship again 2 months after Proxima. She seemed different, more confident. When our captain congratulated her on the victory, she said something I will never forget. She said they had not wanted to fight, but they would never hesitate to defend their people. The old warrior turned back to face the journalist. That should have been the end of it. The humans had proven. They could defend themselves. The Coalition should have left them alone. But some species could not accept that a primitive race had embarrassed the great Krillian Empire. What happened next? Secret meetings started among certain Coalition members, species that felt threatened by human unpredictability. They began planning what they called defensive measures. They said the humans were too violent to be trusted with advanced technology. Kethvar walked to his desk and pulled out an old data pad. I was transferred to intelligence work after Proxima. I started seeing reports about human ship movements and military buildup. The Coalition was gathering information for something bigger. Were the humans preparing for war? They were preparing for survival. Human scout ships began appearing in systems throughout the Outer Rim. They were mapping escape routes and establishing supply caches. They were acting like a species that expected to be attacked. The journalist checked her recording device. Were they right to be worried? The hegemony of tall grasses made the first move 18 months after Proxima. They claimed humans were violating territorial agreements by entering neutral space. They demanded the Coalition take action to contain human expansion. Kethvar set the datapad down and his hands were shaking again. The Coalition Council voted to send an inspection fleet to human space. It was supposed to be peaceful, just a show of authority to keep the humans in line. But it was not peaceful. Admiral Karen Hendricks met our inspection fleet at the edge of human space. She had 30 ships against our 300. By every measure of military power, we should have easily overwhelmed her. The old warrior's voice became very quiet. Hendricks sent one message to our fleet commander. She said human space was not open for inspection. She said we could leave peacefully or we could learn why the Krillians no longer had a stronghold. What did your commander do? He ordered the attack. And that is when the galaxy learned that Proxima was not a lucky victory. It was a demonstration of what humans were capable of when they decided to fight. Kethvar moved to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of something stronger than his usual drink. His hands shook as he poured the amber liquid into his cup. The Battle of Ross 128 changed everything, he said after taking a long sip. I was there, on the bridge of the Silent Dawn, watching our sensors track the human fleet. Admiral Karen Hendricks had only 30 ships, but they were moving in a pattern we had never seen before. The journalist waited as the old warrior gathered his thoughts. She could see this memory was more painful than the others. Our fleet commander was Admiral Zenth of the tall grass species. He was experienced and confident. He had fought in dozens of battles and never lost. When he saw Hendricks approaching with such a small force, he thought it would be easy. Kethvar walked to his star charts and pointed to a system marked in red. Ross 128 was supposed to be a simple inspection. We would demonstrate coalition authority and the humans would submit. Zenth deployed our 300 ships in standard battle formation and waited for the humans to surrender. Did they surrender? Hendricks opened communications and spoke directly to Zenth. She said the coalition fleet was in violation of human territorial rights. She said we had one chance to leave peacefully. Zenth laughed and told her to prepare for capture. The old warrior's voice became strained. What happened next defied everything we knew about space combat. Instead of engaging our main fleet, the human ships scattered in 30 different directions. Within minutes, they were spread across the entire star system. He moved his finger across, the chart showing the battle paths. Each human ship began attacking different targets, not military targets. They hit communication relays and supply stations and civilian infrastructure. They were fighting a completely different war than we. Were they trying to avoid direct combat? No, they were changing the rules of combat. While our fleet stayed in formation, protecting empty space, the humans were dismantling everything that made our presence possible. They cut our communications with Coalition Command. They destroyed the supply depot that was supposed to refuel. Our ships, Kethvar sat down, and his chair creaked under his weight. Admiral Zenth finally realized what was happening. The humans were not trying to defeat our fleet in battle. They were trying to strand us in hostile space with no supplies and no way to call for help. Did he change tactics? He ordered the fleet to split up and pursue individual human ships. That was exactly what Hendricks wanted. Our ships were designed for fleet combat with mutual support. When they operated alone, they were vulnerable. The old warrior pointed to another section of the chart. Commander Pete Williams led one group of human ships in a series of hit-and-run attacks against our dispersed forces. They would appear without warning and target a single coalition ship with overwhelming firepower. Then they would disappear, before reinforcements could arrive. How many ships did you lose? 47 in the first day. But the real damage was psychological. Our crews had never faced an enemy that refused to fight fair. Every engagement was an ambush. Every victory was a trap that led to a bigger defeat. Kethvar stood and walked to the window. Outside, the peaceful Zephyrian landscape seemed far removed from the chaos he was describing. On the second day, Williams broadcast a message on all frequencies. He said the coalition had wanted to play with fire. He said humans were the flame that burns in the vacuum of space. Then he proved it. What did he do? He turned the star system into a maze of destruction. The humans had brought mining charges and industrial explosives. They began detonating asteroids and creating debris fields that blocked our sensors and damaged our ships. The journalist looked up from her notes. Were they trying to destroy the system? They were trying to teach us a lesson. Every action they took showed us how helpless we were against an enemy that fought without rules. They could have destroyed civilian stations, but they evacuated them first. They could have killed prisoners, but they treated them well. Kethvar turned back to face her. By the third day, Admiral Zenth was ready to withdraw. He had lost over 100 ships and achieved nothing, but then he received new orders from Coalition Command. What were the orders? Reinforcements were coming. 3 more fleets with over 1,000 ships total. The Coalition Council had decided that human resistance could not be tolerated. This was no longer an inspection, it was a war. The old warrior walked to another wall display that showed ship classifications. The reinforcements included the best: warships in the Coalition fleet, dreadnoughts from the Crystal Collective, battlecruisers from the Void Walkers, fast attack ships from a dozen different species. How did the humans react when they learned about the reinforcements? Hendricks sent a final message to Admiral Zenth. She said the Coalition had chosen escalation over peace. She said they would. Learn what that choice cost. Kethvar moved his finger across the star chart showing new battle movements. Instead of waiting for the reinforcements to arrive, the humans attacked our remaining ships with everything they had. It was not tactical anymore. It was personal. Did they defeat your fleet? They destroyed it completely. But the cost was terrible for both sides. When the reinforcements arrived 3 days later, they found the Ross 128 system filled with wreckage from both fleets. Hendricks had sacrificed her entire force to eliminate ours. The journalist stopped writing. Was she killed? Her ship was the last one destroyed. But before it exploded, she transmitted the location of every Coalition military base within 50 light years. She had been gathering intelligence while we fought. Kethvar sat back down, and his hands were shaking more now. The human survivors who escaped in life pods were picked up by the reinforcement fleets. They were questioned about human military capabilities and defensive positions. Did they cooperate? They gave false information that led Coalition fleets into carefully prepared ambushes. Even as prisoners, they were still fighting the war. That was when we realized we were not facing a normal enemy. The old warrior took another drink from his cup. The reinforcement fleets spread out to secure human territory. They thought the destruction of Hendricks' fleet had broken human resistance. They were wrong. What happened? Human ships began appearing throughout Coalition space, not fleets. Individual ships and small squadrons. They attacked supply convoys and isolated bases. They rescued their captured personnel and destroyed anything. Of military value, they could reach Kethvar, walked to a communication device, and activated a recording. The voice that emerged was human and filled with determination. The recording was made by Captain Lisa Harper 6 months after Ross 128. She was addressing Coalition leaders from a hidden base somewhere in human space. She said the Coalition had chosen war over peace, and now they would learn what war with humans really meant. What did she mean? She meant that humans do not fight wars to win territory or resources. They fight wars to make their enemies understand that threatening humans is too expensive to be worth the cost. The old warrior turned off the recording and faced the journalist. The spiral wars lasted 3 years. Every Coalition attempt to control human space was met with resistance that grew stronger over time. The humans were learning from each battle and becoming more dangerous. Did the Coalition consider making peace? Some species wanted to negotiate, but others said the humans had to be completely defeated or they would always be a threat. The Crystal Collective and the Void Walkers formed an alliance to eliminate human civilization entirely. Kethvar returned to his chair, and his breathing was heavy. That decision led to the siege of Terra Nova, and that is where the Coalition learned that there are worse things than fighting humans in space. What is worse? Fighting humans who have nothing left to lose. Kethvar set his cup down and stared at it for a long moment before speaking. The journalist could see that this next part of the story was the hardest for him to tell. Terra Nova was humanity's most important colony world, he said finally. 2 million civilians lived there, including the families of their military leaders. The Coalition Council believed that threatening this world would force the humans to surrender. He walked to a large tactical display that dominated one wall of his room. The screen showed a 3-dimensional map of the Terra Nova system with ship positions marked in different colors. We assembled the largest fleet in galactic history for the siege. 10,000 ships from 40 different species. Dreadnoughts, and battle cruisers and carrier groups. The finest military technology from across the coalition. The journalist looked at the massive scale of the display. Was this meant to be the final battle? It was meant to be a demonstration. The coalition leaders thought that when humans saw such overwhelming force, they would realize resistance was hopeless. They would negotiate surrender rather than watch their most important world be destroyed. HFY activated the display, and ship movements began playing across the screen. I was aboard the Silent Dawn again, serving as a tactical analyst. When we entered the Terra Nova system, our sensors immediately began scanning for human defenses. What did you find? Nothing. The space around Terra Nova was completely empty. No defense platforms or orbital stations. No fleet waiting to fight us. The planet itself showed no signs of military activity. The old warrior pointed to the display where the coalition fleet formed a blockade around the planet. Admiral Zenth commanded the siege force. He sent surrender demands to the planetary government. He gave them 48 hours to evacuate all military personnel and surrender the world to coalition control. Did they respond? Colonel Amy Rodriguez was the military commander on Terra Nova. She sent back a simple message. She said if the coalition wanted their world, they could take it. But she warned us that we might not like what we found. HFY walked to another section of the room where photographs showed the Terra Nova colony before the siege. Green fields and modern cities stretched across continents under an orange sky. We thought Rodriguez was bluffing. Our intelligence reports showed that Terra Nova had factories and shipyards and research facilities. It was too valuable for the humans to destroy just to spite us. The journalist studied the photographs. Were the civilians evacuated? Our sensors detected massive transport activity in the days before the siege. Thousands of ships carried people and equipment away from the planet. By the time we arrived, Terra Nova appeared almost empty. HFY returned to the tactical display and continued the playback. Admiral Zenth decided to land troops rather than bombard the planet from orbit. He wanted to capture the industrial facilities intact. He sent down the first wave with 50,000 coalition soldiers. Did they meet resistance? At first, no. The landing forces secured the major cities without opposition. They found the factories and shipyards abandoned, but intact. It seemed like the humans had simply given up their most important world. The old warrior's voice became strained as he continued. The troops began searching for any remaining human military personnel. They found empty bases and deserted command centers. Everything seemed too easy. He paused the display at a moment that showed landing craft descending toward the planet's surface. Then Colonel Rodriguez made her final broadcast. She appeared on every communication channel in the system. She said the coalition wanted to learn about human determination. She said they were about to get a lesson they would never forget. What happened? The first explosions began in the abandoned cities. Not random destruction, but carefully planned demolitions. The humans had rigged every important building and facility with charges. They were destroying everything of value rather than let us have it. HFY activated another section of the display that showed ground combat data. But that was just the beginning. Human soldiers began emerging from hidden bunkers and underground facilities. They had never evacuated. They had been waiting. The journalist looked at the combat data scrolling across the screen. How many humans were still on the planet? We estimated 50,000 military personnel. But they were not fighting to defend positions or protect resources. They were fighting to make our occupation as costly as possible. The old warrior walked to a cabinet and pulled out a data pad covered with combat reports. The human tactics were unlike anything we had seen. They would attack our positions and then disappear into tunnel systems. They used improvised weapons and booby traps. They turned the entire planet into a death maze. Did they have any chance of winning? They were not trying to win in any conventional sense. They were trying to teach us that occupying human territory would cost more than it was worth. Every building we captured was rigged with explosives. Every supply depot we established was attacked by human commandos. Kethvar returned to the tactical display and showed the escalating ground combat. Admiral Zenth committed more troops to secure the planet. By the end of the first week, we had 200,000 soldiers on Terra Nova. The casualties were mounting every day. How bad were the losses? We were losing 1,000 soldiers per day to an enemy we could barely find. The humans used their knowledge of the terrain to launch surprise attacks and then vanish. They poisoned our water supplies and sabotaged our equipment. The old warrior's hands shook as he accessed another file. The worst part was the psychological warfare. The humans would broadcast messages to our troops describing exactly how they planned to kill them. They made it personal. Were your soldiers afraid? Terrified? These were experienced warriors from dozens of species, but they had never faced an enemy that seemed to enjoy being outnumbered. The humans fought like they had already accepted death and just wanted to take as many of us with them as possible. Kethvar showed the journalist a recording device. This is a transmission from Sergeant Mike Chen recorded during the final bombardment of Terra Nova. Admiral Zenth had decided that orbital bombardment was the only way to end the resistance. He activated the recording and a human voice filled the room. The words were calm despite the sound of explosions in the background. The sergeant was speaking to his wife and daughter who had been evacuated before the siege. He told them he loved them and that he was proud to defend their world. Then he addressed the coalition fleet directly. What did he say? He said we could destroy Terra Nova, but we could never destroy what it represented. He said every human world would fight like Terra Nova if we tried to conquer them. He said we should tell our children about this day so they would understand what happens when you threaten a human's home. The recording ended with the sound of explosions and static. Kethvar turned off the device and sat down heavily. The orbital bombardment lasted 12 hours. When it was over, Terra Nova was a smoking ruin. The cities were destroyed and the countryside was burned. 2 million civilians had been evacuated, but 50,000 human soldiers died defending an empty world. Did the siege break human resistance? It did the opposite. News of Terra Nova spread throughout human space and to every species in the galaxy. The humans had sacrificed their most important colony rather than let us have it. They had proven that no human world could be conquered without paying a terrible price. The journalist looked at her notes. How did the coalition react? Some species were horrified by what we had done. Others were more determined than ever to destroy human civilization completely. The galaxy began choosing sides. Kethvar walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful landscape. But the real change was in how the war itself evolved. After Terra Nova, the humans stopped trying to defend fixed positions. They became something much more dangerous. What did they become? Ghosts. Shadows that struck without warning and disappeared before we could respond. They turned the entire galaxy into a battlefield where nowhere was safe. The old warrior turned back to face the journalist. That was when we realized we were not fighting a war anymore. We were fighting an idea. And ideas are much harder to kill than ships or planets. Kethvar walked to a locked cabinet and withdrew a small container filled with memory crystals. His hands trembled as he selected one and inserted it into a viewing device. After Terra Nova, the humans scattered throughout the galaxy like smoke, he said. They abandoned the idea of defending territory and became something that haunted our nightmares. The viewing device projected holographic images of damaged ships and destroyed stations. The journalist could see the fear in the old warrior's eyes as he watched the recordings. I was reassigned to a patrol squadron tasked with hunting down human survivors. Command believed that with Terra Nova destroyed and their main fleet scattered, the remaining humans would be easy to capture. He paused the recording on an image of a coalition cruiser drifting in space with massive hull breaches. We encountered our first ghost ship 3 months after the siege. The UES Defiant had been missing for weeks after a battle in the Rigel system. What made it a ghost ship? When we found it, the vessel was still operational, but there were no life signs aboard. Our boarding party expected to find an abandoned hulk. Instead, they found a ship that was still fighting a war. Kethvar advanced the recording to show the interior of the damaged human vessel. Bodies floated in the corridors, but automated systems continued to function. The crew had been dead for weeks, but they had programmed their ship's computer to continue combat operations. It had standing orders to attack any coalition vessel that came within range. The dead were still fighting us. The journalist looked at the disturbing images with growing unease. "How many ghost ships did you encounter?" "Dozens. Sometimes we would respond to distress calls from coalition stations only to find they had been attacked by vessels with dead crews. The humans had turned death itself into a weapon." The old warrior removed the crystal and selected another one. "But the ghost ships were not the worst thing we faced. That distinction belongs to Lieutenant Commander Susan Blake." "Who was she?" "The sole survivor of Research Station Omega in the Vega system. When we arrived to investigate why the station had gone silent, we found her alone among the bodies of her colleagues." The new recording showed a sterile laboratory facility floating in the darkness of space. Emergency lights cast eerie shadows through the observation windows. Blake had been working on some kind of biological research when coalition forces attacked the station. Her team was killed in the assault, but she survived by hiding in a sealed laboratory. Kethvar's voice became very quiet. "She spent 6 months alone on that station working on something she called Project Famine. When we finally boarded the facility, she was waiting for us in the main lab." "What was Project Famine?" "A virus designed specifically to target the Coalition's primary food crops." Blake had analyzed biological samples from dozens of member species and created something that could destroy our agricultural systems. The recording showed a woman in a damaged lab coat standing calmly among scientific equipment. Her face was gaunt, but her eyes burned with determination. She had enough of the virus to contaminate the food supply for half the galaxy. One ship carrying infected samples to Coalition agricultural worlds could have caused mass starvation across hundreds of systems. The journalist stopped taking notes and stared at the hologram. "Did she use it?" "She made us an offer. She would destroy the virus samples if we agreed to end the war and recognize human independence. She gave us 24 hours to decide." Kethvar advanced the recording to show the final confrontation in the laboratory. Coalition soldiers surrounded the human scientist, but she remained calm. Our commander refused her terms. He said the Coalition did not negotiate with terrorists. Blake nodded like she had expected that answer. Then she activated the station's self-destruct sequence. She killed herself. She made a choice. In her final transmission, she said that if humans could not have peace, then no one in the galaxy could have plenty. She died to prevent her weapon from being used, but also to show us what desperation could create. The old warrior removed the crystal, and his hands were shaking badly now. The news of Project Famine spread throughout Coalition space. Every species began to wonder what other weapons desperate humans might be developing. He walked to his desk and pulled out a folder marked with security classifications. The ghost ships and suicide scientists were bad enough, but they were just individuals. The real terror began when entire human populations started disappearing. Disappearing how colony worlds that had been populated for decades suddenly went silent. When Coalition fleets arrived, they found empty cities and abandoned facilities, but no signs of violence or evacuation. Kethvar opened the folder and showed the journalist surveillance images of deserted human settlements. The populations had simply vanished. Meals were left half-eaten on tables. Personal belongings remained in homes. It was like everyone had just walked away. Where did they go? We never found out. Some intelligence analysts believed the humans had developed some kind of mass teleportation technology. Others thought they had built hidden colonies in unexplored systems. The old warrior walked to the window and stared out at the darkening sky. But I think the truth was simpler and more frightening. The humans had learned to become invisible. They were still there, but we could no longer see them. What do you mean? Ships would arrive at human worlds expecting to find targets for bombardment or populations to capture. Instead, they found nothing but empty buildings and silent streets. It was psychological warfare on a massive scale. Kethvar turned back to face the journalist. The not knowing was worse than fighting. At least when humans attacked us, we could fight back. But how do you fight an enemy that refuses to exist where you can find them? Did this strategy work? Coalition morale began to collapse. Crews were afraid to board any human facility because they might find ghost crews or booby traps. Landing parties refused to search empty colonies because they felt like they were being watched by invisible enemies. The old warrior returned to his chair and sat down heavily. The final psychological blow came when we realized the humans were still watching us, even when we could not see them. How did you know coalition fleet movements were being reported to human forces with impossible accuracy? Our secret bases were being attacked by enemies who should not have known they existed. Someone was gathering intelligence from inside our own command structure. Kethvar opened another file and showed communication intercepts. We began finding evidence that humans had infiltrated coalition facilities using advanced disguises or possibly stolen identity technology. Were there human spies among your crews? We never knew for certain. But paranoia spread through the coalition fleet like a disease. Crews began suspecting their own officers of being human agents. Unit cohesion broke down as everyone wondered who they could trust. The journalist looked at the evidence files with growing understanding. The humans were making you destroy yourselves. Exactly. They had learned that defeating a superior enemy required more than just military tactics. They had to attack our confidence and our unity and our will to continue. Fighting. Kethvar closed the files and stood up slowly. By the end of the 5th year of war, the coalition had superior numbers and technology, but we were fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Did anyone suggest making peace? Some species began to question whether the war was worth the cost. The Crystal Collective had lost hundreds of ships to ghost attacks. The Void Walkers were dealing with crop failures that might have been natural or might have been sabotage. The old warrior walked to the memorial wall where pictures of his dead friends hung in neat rows. But the hardliners insisted that human resistance had to be completely crushed. They said any negotiated peace would just give humans time to develop even more terrible weapons. What ended the war? Exhaustion. Not military defeat, but the simple recognition that we were fighting an enemy that would never stop, regardless of the cost to themselves. Kethvar touched one of the photographs on the wall. The humans had taught us something that no species in the galaxy wanted to learn. Some things are worth more than life itself. Kethvar moved to the final cabinet in his room and withdrew a single data crystal marked with coalition command seals. His movements were slow and deliberate as he prepared to share the last part of his story. The war ended on a Tuesday, he said, with bitter irony in his voice. Not with a great battle or dramatic surrender, but with a simple meeting in neutral space. The journalist looked up from her notes. Who decided to negotiate? Coalition High Command finally accepted what field commanders had been reporting for months. We were not winning. Despite overwhelming advantages in numbers and technology, we were losing ships and personnel faster than we could replace them. Kethvar inserted the crystal into his viewer, and holographic images appeared showing a small space station floating in the void between star systems. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries. No one wanted to be seen as weak by requesting negotiations. Did the humans agree to meet? Admiral Nancy Torres represented what remained of the human military command. When she arrived at the station, she brought only 2 escorts. The coalition delegation included representatives from 30 different species. The recording showed a tall woman in a simple uniform walking into a conference room filled with alien officials. Her bearing was confident despite the odds against. Her Torres looked at the beings who had spent years trying to destroy her species, and her first words were asking if we were ready for round 2. It was not a joke. She was genuinely asking if we wanted to continue the war. Kethvar paused the recording at a moment showing Torres sitting calmly across from coalition leaders who had expected to dictate surrender terms. Admiral Zenth spoke. For the coalition. He listed human violations of galactic law and demanded unconditional surrender. He said humans would be relocated to supervised worlds and their military would be disbanded. How did Torres respond? She listened politely until he finished speaking. Then she placed a data pad on the table and said it contained coordinates for hidden human fleets throughout the galaxy. She said Zenth could try to hunt them down or he could listen to her counter-proposal. The old warrior advanced the recording to show the tension in the conference room as coalition officials realized they were not dictating terms to a defeated enemy. Torres said humans wanted only one thing: to be left alone. They would stop all military actions against coalition targets if the coalition agreed to recognize human territorial sovereignty and withdraw all forces from human space. Was that acceptable to the coalition? Some delegates were outraged. They said humans had no right to make demands after causing so much destruction. Others pointed out that continuing the war would cost more than accepting human independence. Kethvar showed the journalist historical data about war casualties and resource expenditure. The numbers were staggering. The coalition had lost over 40,000 ships and millions of personnel. The economic cost was bankrupting entire member species. What convinced them to accept peace? Torres made it clear that humans would never surrender, regardless of the cost. She said they had prepared for wars of extinction and were willing to fight until every human was dead, rather than accept subjugation. The recording showed Torres speaking with quiet intensity about human determination and the price of freedom. Her words carried absolute conviction. She told the delegates that humans had learned something important during the war. They had learned that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. She said freedom was one of those things. Kethvar paused the recording and faced the journalist. The Coalition Council voted to accept human terms 18 hours later. It was not a military decision, but an economic one. Continuing the war would have destroyed the coalition itself. How did member species react to the peace agreement? Mixed reactions. Some were relieved that the fighting was over. Others felt humiliated that a primitive species had forced the mighty coalition to negotiate. There were protests and political upheaval on dozens of worlds. The old warrior removed the crystal and walked to his memorial wall. But the smart species learned the real lesson of the war. They learned that technological superiority means nothing against an enemy that refuses to be conquered. Did the peace hold? Humans resumed their expansion into space as if nothing had happened. They established new colonies and built new fleets. They traded with species that wanted to trade and ignored those that did not. Kethvar pointed to a photograph showing human and alien delegates signing trade agreements. Within 5 years, human technology was spreading throughout the galaxy. Not through conquest, but through voluntary exchange. Were they sharing military technology? No. Humans were very careful about that. They shared medical advances and agricultural improvements and industrial processes. But their weapons remained a human monopoly. The journalist looked at the peaceful images with some surprise. Did this create tension? Some species complained about human secrecy, but most accepted it as reasonable caution. After all, the coalition had tried to destroy human civilization. Why would humans trust us with the tools of war? Kethvar walked to his desk and pulled out a recent news report. Today, humans are full members of the galactic community. They serve on trade councils and participate in scientific exchanges. But everyone remembers the war. How has the war changed galactic politics? No species threatens humans anymore. Not directly, anyway. Everyone understands the cost of pushing humans too far. They prefer negotiation to confrontation. The old warrior sat down in his chair for the last time. But the real change is deeper than politics. The war taught the galaxy something about the nature of freedom and the price of preserving it. What did it teach? That there are beings in the universe who value their principles more than their lives. Most species will compromise when faced with superior force. Humans will fight until they are extinct, rather than accept slavery. Kethvar looked at the memorial wall where pictures of coalition soldiers hung alongside images of human opponents. We learned to respect that even if we could not understand it. Do you think the war was worth fighting? That is a question I have asked myself every day for 20 years. The coalition lost millions of lives and spent trillions of credits trying to subjugate a species that just wanted to be left alone. The old warrior's voice became very quiet. If we had simply accepted human independence from the beginning, there would have been no war at all. But some lessons can only be learned through experience. The journalist checked her recording device one final time. What would you want people to remember about the war? I would want them to remember that humans did not start the fight, but they finished it. They showed mercy to defeated enemies and restraint in victory. They taught the galaxy that freedom has a price, and sometimes that price must be paid in blood. Kethvar stood and walked to the window where evening shadows were falling across the peaceful landscape. I would also want them to remember that humans are not naturally violent. They are naturally protective. There is a difference. Is there anything else you want to say? Yes. At the bottom of my memorial wall, there is a phrase in the human language. It says, "Peace through strength and strength through sacrifice." Those words now appear on monuments throughout the galaxy. The old warrior turned to face the journalist one last time. We thought we were fighting a war against humanity. We were wrong. We were receiving an education about the price of threatening a species that values freedom above life itself. He walked her to the door of his room. The humans did not just win the war. They taught the galaxy a lesson that will echo for millennia. Some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost, and some people will never stop fighting for those things. As the journalist prepared to leave, Kethvar offered one final observation. Humanity's greatest weapon was never their technology or their tactics. It was their absolute unwillingness to surrender their principles regardless of how impossible the odds became. The door closed softly behind her, leaving the old veteran, alone with his memories and the photographs of friends who had learned too late what it meant to fight a species that refused to be conquered.